The history of slavery in ancient Rome is marked by darkness and brutality. From forced labor to sexual mistreatment, the acts inflicted upon slaves in ancient Rome reflect the inhumanity of the institution of slavery. This video delves into the depths of these unspeakable acts committed against slaves in ancient Rome. During Julius Caesar's brief reign, 49 BCE to 44 BCE, he felt the need to increase his support in the Senate by creating new positions. Unlike previous times, the individuals appointed to these positions were not Roman, but rather from Gaul, which is now modern-day France. The Gaulish society, although more advanced than previously believed, was not as advanced as the Romans. The newly appointed senators were amazed by the grandeur of Rome, including its size, unique buildings, crowded streets, art, and advanced technology, which was unlike anything they had ever seen before. However, they did recognize one familiar aspect of Rome: its abundance of slaves. The history of slavery in ancient Rome is a dark and gruesome one. Slaves were considered property and were subjected to unspeakable acts of cruelty and violence at the hands of their masters. The treatment of slaves varied depending on their role and status, but all were subject to abuse and exploitation. From forced labor to sexual exploitation, the unspeakable things that masters did to slaves in ancient Rome are a testament to the inhumanity of the institution of slavery. In this video, we will explore some of the most heinous acts committed against slaves in ancient Rome. Different positions of slaves in Roman society. The Roman society was divided into different classes, and the slaves were a part of it. The slaves were involved in various activities for the Romans. The highest position for a slave was to be a learned advisor to the leading men of Rome, who were mostly Greeks. Greek tutors were considered a status symbol in Roman high society. The next position was of domestic slaves who worked as personal servants, servers, kitchen staff, cleaners, etc. Any Roman citizen who could afford a slave had one, and it was a symbol of status. The lowest position was of workers on large farms, quarries, mines, marshes, etc. These slaves had miserable lives and were often treated harshly by their owners. The worst situation for a slave was that of a galley slave or a worker in the mines. The gladiators were another group of slaves who were exalted to a degree in Rome. Some gladiators were given their freedom after living through a number of fights or bringing glory to their owners. However, most slaves never achieved freedom, and it was just a dream for them. Many slaves were born into slavery or were taken during the war, and they knew nothing of freedom. Despite everything, many slaves preferred living in Rome rather than being on the run with the possibility of excruciating torture at the end. Punishments. In Rome, there were several ways of carrying out punishments for slaves, but the most widely used method was crucifixion. Crucifixion is a form of execution that involves the victim being nailed or tied to a wooden cross and left to die. It was a common method of execution in ancient times, particularly in the Roman Empire. Not only was this punishment used for slaves, but this method was also used for punishing people who had done a variety of crimes, including rebellion, treason, and sedition. Undoubtedly, the most well-known crucifixion is that of Jesus, who was accused of claiming to be the King of the Jews, a title that the Romans, having conquered Israel, did not approve of. However, the crucifixion of Jesus was not unique, as thousands, if not millions of people were crucified by the Romans during their rule over much of Europe, the Mediterranean coastline, and the Middle East. Crucifixion was a painful and excruciating method of execution that could take hours, and death was often caused by drowning, exposure, or shock. Most people who were crucified were mistreated before being nailed to wooden boards. In addition, slaves who attempted escape or plotted to revolt or disobeyed orders were often executed in various ways, including being beaten to death, whipped, or trampled by elephants in Africa. The death of Jesus made Rome synonymous with crucifixion, a practice that was not unique to Rome, but was widely used in other societies as well. Stadium. Rome, an ancient city and empire, is famous for its Colosseum, a stadium where various events, including gladiatorial games, were held. However, other cities in the Roman Empire also had amphitheaters or colosseums, with Nimes, France having one of the most well-preserved examples. These colosseums were often sites of execution and served as a form of entertainment, with slaves being the most common victims. Slaves were typically punished for their involvement in revolts or for their Christian faith, which was not yet adopted by Rome. In some cases, slaves were dressed as former Roman enemies and made to reenact famous battles. Christians and other individuals were subjected to brutal deaths, such as being fed to wild animals, gored by bulls or oxen, or trampled by elephants. The Romans used their imagination to come up with different ways to execute people, including wrapping them in pitch-covered linen and setting them on fire. The most disturbing aspect of these executions was that people would cheer while others suffered. Rebellion. The Roman slave owners were known for being harsh, but some were also practical. They understood that people are more motivated to work for someone they trust and respect rather than a cruel taskmaster. However, even the kindest of slave owners had to use force at times to get their slaves to work. They were always on the lookout for potential revolts and crushed them quickly. Some slave owners treated their slaves better than others, which resulted in fewer revolts. Rome had strict laws against hiding runaway slaves, and they employed professional slave catchers to track them down. Advertisements were put up with detailed descriptions of the escaped slaves, and rewards were offered for their capture. If caught, runaways faced severe punishment, including whipping, branding with the letters FUG on the forehead, burning with iron, or even death. Slaves were sometimes forced to wear metal collars around their necks. The most famous slave revolt was led by Spartacus and his fellow gladiators. They escaped captivity and were hoping to reach Sicily, but their uprising was considered a war by the Romans. Spartacus was killed in combat, but many of his followers were not. Thousands of them were crucified on the hills overlooking the Appian Way leading into Rome. Sexual slavery. During ancient Rome, slaves were acquired through war and sold to the Romans by people from their empire, particularly in Africa and the Middle East. They were also traded between Romans throughout their territory. Wealthy slave owners preferred not to spend money on purchasing more slaves, and instead bred them themselves. This involved deliberately impregnating women and girls, either by other slaves or their owners, to create a ready-made slave population. This practice was driven by economics, as was the prevalence of prostitution, which was another form of sexual slavery. Brothels were common in Rome and its empire, and while not all brothel workers were slaves, many were more attractive women and girls, as well as young men and boys. Homosexuality and the sexual exploitation of slaves were not taboo in Rome before the rise of Christianity. Freedom. Although most Roman slaves were considered slaves for life, some were able to earn their freedom. This was most common for slaves who worked directly for their owners in households or smaller farms, where they developed close relationships. Many of these slaves were owned by wealthy and influential men who granted freedom to their slaves in their wills or as a reward for saving their lives, among other reasons. However, freed slaves were typically not granted Roman citizenship unless they served a specific period in the Roman auxiliary forces. This privilege was only available to men of a certain age and required several years of service. In conclusion, slavery was an integral part of ancient Rome's economy and society. Slaves were acquired through war and trade and used for labor and sexual exploitation. Some slave owners treated their slaves well, but many were cruel. Some slaves earned their freedom, but not always Roman citizenship. Slavery was a complex and controversial institution.